My name is Jillian, and I'm so pleased to have you all here at the 2017 National Tiny Homes and Simple Living Jamboree. We are so blessed and honored to have two of the pioneers of this tiny home movement here with us today. Jay Schaefer, right here. He has been living in and designing tiny homes for people all over the world since 1997. And he's inspired and taught others about living with everything they want and need and nothing they don't since then. And then Dee Williams is a builder, teacher, and author and humorist. She just said something pretty funny up here, too. And Dee lives in Olympia, Washington in a 56 square foot house, satisfied that life is, by her own admission, pretty good. And they're going to be talking today back and forth about the tiny house business journey as well. So can't wait to hear this. So glad you guys are all here. Here we go.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So kind of what Jay and I brainstormed on was we got together yesterday and just talked about our parallel journeys over time. And so what we were hoping to be able to do is just kind of make it like an interview. So we came up with some questions, and so I'm gonna start the question, and Jay is gonna answer it, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And has everybody heard of Jay Schaefer? Yeah. Say it really loud. He needs. So he's not going to be able to fit through the bathroom stall doors later because his ego is. So thank you for that. That'll be funny to watch. So let me start out with Jay.
Dee?
You know, most people know your story, but can you explain like the first years, the late 90s? I don't know what the music was at that time. Was that still Go-Go Girls or was it something else? Okay. Who? It was terrible. Can you explain the first years and the reasons you built your first house? And then maybe, and then I'll have a follow-up question for you.
Okay.
First years.
First years. Well, it's hard to know where to start because I was raised in McMansion, had to clean the McMansion. That was my job on the weekend. So I wasn't a big fan of extra space. You know, we had one of those libraries where you buy books because they look good on the binding, and it was my job to dust those. I think it really started for me, you know, I lived in the back of a pickup for a while, but really I decided I need a sense of home, so I bought an Airstream trailer, lived in that for 2 years, made it kind of homey, learned what I needed and what I didn't need. That was a nice Thoreauian experiment. I needed insulation, it turned out, in Iowa in the winter. So I designed and built my own house on a trailer. And I wanted that to be very homey. And I did have this inkling, like, people should know about this because it was very hard to find. I could not afford a mortgage. And so I wanted a nice place, so I pushed it a little bit by entering a contest at Natural Home Magazine. As I was filling out the form, it said special challenges, and my girlfriend at the time whispered over my shoulder, I have a lot of challenges, and that was the beginning.
So in that space, you were living in the backyard in your tiny house, and then you owned the big house, right? Were you ever afraid that code enforcement was going to come by, or?
Oh yeah, I did learn, just as I was starting to build my tiny house on wheels after the Airstream, that I could not live on a residential lot in a little house on wheels in town as I wanted to, so I had to buy a 300 square foot house. I camped out in the backyard because that would be legal, and I did clear it with the building department and the zoning department beforehand. They said, just call it camping out. You can camp out as much as you want, so I camped out for 5 years.
Wow.
And so I was actually a bit afraid because I had this feeling that the feds were going to come down on me because this code stuff was really pushed. Like, you got to follow the code, got to be code compliant. So I imagined this tiny Waco where I would stand on my porch with a shotgun waiting for the AFTA to show up for my own tiny Waco. And fortunately, it's been a lot easier than that because everybody, even the feds seem to be in agreement that this is a good idea.
Plus, you don't have a shotgun.
I don't have a shotgun.
Yeah, that makes it difficult.
Now, Dee, I want to ask you the same question back.
So,
First years.
Yeah, the first years, I decided to build my house because I wanted to simplify for a lot of different reasons. Building it was a challenge. Mistakes were made. I glued my ponytail to the house and had to be sheared off. And and then living in the house, I found some friends that let me live in their yard. And it was an experiment, and that's kind of the way I approached it. Like I just finished doing this lifestyles workshop, and what I was trying to stress in that workshop is that we have a tendency to want to have an A+ life. And living in a tiny house for me has been a good, solid B+. Like sometimes it works, and sometimes it just doesn't. Same like building. Sometimes you remember to move your ponytail, and other times you don't. So that was kind of the beginning for me. And then as far as code enforcement goes, I called the city of Olympia. This was after an article came out in the local paper about my tiny house and my living situation. And I was like, ooh, I better get ahead of the curve on this one, sort of. So I called the city office and asked them to come out and take a look around and just let me know if there was a problem. So they came out. It was this really nice woman. I greeted her. I'm a hazardous waste inspector, so I've had this done to me when I show up for an inspection. I had coffee and fresh strawberries for her. I had cleaned everything really, really well. I wasn't wearing coveralls for the first time in several days. And so I just greeted her with such kindness and hope that there wouldn't be a problem. And not long after that, my friends Hugh and Annie, whose yard I was living in, they got a letter from the city. And all it had was the rules, what the city considered a residence, what the city considered an RV, and the key line in that is that you can recreate in an RV. They viewed my house as an RV, but you can recreate, but you can't live in it. They didn't say you have to move it. They didn't give any action items. So I decided to, that year, recreationally do my taxes, which was really fun. I was recreating all the time, really. It was a very recreational life. And it kind of continued that way for 12 years in that backyard. And, then I got to shift to another backyard, not that long, last year actually, and I recreate there as well. So that's my deal.
The word recreate means, it's actually, the etymology on that is recreate, by the way, so good job.
That's perfect, thank you. So here's another one for you, Jay. Is this forum working for people? Yeah? We'll have time for Q&A too. So you can ask Jay where he poops and stuff like that. Everybody wants to know. That's the best question I get all the time. Do you ever miss your first tiny house?
I do not miss, I've lived in about 5 tiny houses by now, and I don't miss any of them. I don't miss the Airstream trailer. They were great houses, but every house I've moved out of, I moved out of because I was able to see where I could make it even better. So I always live in the best house I've ever lived in. And with some exception, for example, when I'm not living in a house at all. But so I don't miss that at all. How about you, Dee?
This forum is funny for me. So last summer, I gave my house away, my little gable-roofed house, and downsized into a 54 square foot house, 56 square feet. I don't want to leave that 2 feet out. Woo. But it's got a curved roof, and I gave my house to my nephew. He moved it to Colorado, And I don't miss the house because my nephew is more important to me. And this house for him represented moving out of a tent into something better. And so kind of recognizing the privilege of being able to live in that house for as long as I did was kind of, I kind of stepped into that instead of the loss, a letting go of this baby I created. It was like sending a kid off to college. You know, I felt like an empty nester, but then I had this new experiment going on in a slightly smaller space. And so that was actually an amazing adventure, and it had bumps. You know, it wasn't a perfect thing. Again, I shoot for a good solid B average in life. I'm trying to knock it out of the park in other ways, but as far as creature comforts go and stuff like that, I'm really trying to focus on what I love and what's important to me. So I don't really miss it.
I think it's interesting that a lot of tiny house people they downsize once they've got their first tiny house, maybe 16 feet long. Within a couple years, they're in 12 feet. I'm moving, I just sold my tiny house a week ago so that I can build and move into a house that's just 8 feet long. Because I never use my bathroom and kitchen. I always outsource that. And so I'm not, you know, and then those have always been sort of showpieces, like you could have a bathroom and kitchen in this design that I live in, but I'm tired of living in anything with showpieces because there's really no space for that in my life right now, so I won't miss any of that or the stuff. People wonder, will you miss your stuff? I've never met anybody who misses their stuff because you can always take a picture of it, stuff it into an envelope, and then never look at it again.
Okay, so this is more the business side of it, but what motivated you to get your story out there? Natural Home Magazine, you know, that was the magazine that I read that inspired me to stalk you and build my own house. So, you know, to put your story out there in a vulnerable way with unknowns like code enforcement, to write a book, and to sell plans, and then ultimately to, you know, start a company. Like, what was the thought behind that?
At that time, I was of the impression that the way to spread a message in America is through a business, and that's the way we do things around here. And that is why I started a tiny house company. Maybe if I knew what the word blog meant at that time, I would have just done that, because frankly, I am not a business-minded person. I'm more of a designer, artsy type, creative type, by far. And yet, the business platform for spreading the message has worked very well. How about you, Dee?
So similar story again, and my desire was, I was just so excited about the way I built my house. I did a lot of the engineering review around it. I really looked at salvage materials, green materials, and I learned a lot about green building. And then in the backyard, I was discovering kind of this marrow in life about letting go of autonomy and stepping into a certain kind of vulnerability when you share stuff, like a bathroom. So as an example, I would go into Hugh and Annie's house, and they had 2 kids. Kellen was 7 at the time. They have 1 bathroom. So I'd go into that house and take a shower. And I'm in the shower one day, and Kellen walks in and starts to pee. And all of a sudden I hear him stop peeing suddenly. And he goes, "Hi." And I go, "Hi." So kind of discovering kind of this intimacy by letting go. And it was very sweet. And sometimes it was bumpy, but for the most part it was really sweet. I wanted to get the word out on a couple of things. One was engineering, like how to build safely, how to follow the international, code on building. So you build something safe that can withstand an earthquake and a hurricane at the same time if you're moving it down the road. And so that was really important to me because I didn't want to see people build poorly and then somebody get hurt. So I wanted to get the word out for that, and then also just wanted to kind of get the word out about voluntary simplicity. So that's kind of why I let my story go out into the universe, and why I started a company. And I also, I have to admit, kind of wanted a tax write-off as a sole proprietorship. And that was one way to get a break on my taxes. I was used to, I had a mortgage, and you get this huge break when you do your taxes. So I didn't have that break anymore. So it was one way for me to offset the expense of taking my house to green building shows and taking my house to the local grade school and letting a bunch of booger-nosed kids climb all over it. It was a way for me to cover those costs so that I could get the word out on that stuff. That was a long answer.
Yes, it was. No,
You okay?
I'm good. Actually, I want to make the answer even longer for myself, too. I think that vulnerability part is important because, well, I only know like the etymology of 3 words, and I think I will use all 3 of them today at some point or another.
That's so cool.
Yeah. It makes
Is
me look smart.
etymology when you eat?
Now, etymology is a word thing.
Oh,
The
okay.
etymology of the word authority goes back to author or authentic of the true self. And despite the people we call authorities in our culture oftentimes, I think that true authority is gained through sharing one's own story and influencing others that way in a more sustainable way than just through fear or whatever other controlling means you might choose. And I always am far more influenced by people like Dee.
Oh, Jay.
Yes. People who share their own story as a means of influencing me. It's not like it's hitting you over the head in a didactic way, like, you should live smaller because big houses are not as efficient, blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of like civil disobedience, but without the pepper spray, which I like. It's far more comfortable that way.
So, in all of this stuff you've done over the last, 17 decades of tiny house stuff, like, if you were to name the sweet spot in that, and I'm talking about living in a house, getting the word out, and starting a business, like, of that, like, what would you say was the sweetest part of it?
That is a tough one.
I know.
You did not warn me of this question.
No, it's on the paper.
Oh, I forget things.
It's on the paper.
Actually just being more free, like living small, as we both know, as many of us know, doesn't make life easy inherently, but if I'd gone through all the strife I've gone through in the past 17 years with a big house and a big mortgage along with it, I might be dead by now. So, or at least totally crazy. And so I think that freedom is the best part for me.
Okay. Some by already going smaller, some by upsizing like my nephew, some by rethinking what they want and need in life and being willing to tell me about it or share their stories with other people in the world. Hari was one of the first people that was blogging about her experience in a tiny house with kids. And so there are all these people that have done amazing things by being willing to step into kind of the notion that life can be bigger, and it doesn't always mean big. Does that make any sense?
Yes, and I want to copy your answer and retract my own. My favorite part, actually, at the first Jamboree, and actually at every Jamboree, at least one person has come up to me and said, "You changed my life." And I know that's not entirely true, like other things. Like, this is not a one-man show or one-woman show, but man, that feels good. And she was crying, which made me cry. It was awesome.
That's cool. So I have another one for you. Anything that you would do different?
Well, my 12-step program would say that everything has happened just for a good reason. All the hell is just the path on the way to a better future. So I can't say that I would do anything different. Sometimes I've felt like I wish I had done things differently, but actually everything does seem to pan out so far. Not easily, but no, I do not wish to do anything differently. How about you, Dee Williams?
Well, I want to follow up first.
Yes.
So nothing different, and I understand that, but what about regrets?
Regrets. I've had a few. The end. No, well, there are things I regret. You know, things that were more, it seems that when I've actually tried to control anything in my life, it hasn't worked out as well as when I just let it happen and unfold. And at a certain point, when I realized the tiny house movement was taking on a life of its own and the message was no longer in my hands by any means, like I haven't even tried to direct that message for quite a few years now. But when that was first going on, I was like, no, you know, they can't come in with the commercial stuff now. This thing's just getting started. And in the end, of course, all that commercial stuff helps. It's all part of the movement. I mean, I really figured there are like several movements here. And
What are those?
well, there is I think the tiny house movement, it's in its origins is very based on authenticity, you know, authorship, sharing one's own story, being one's own true self. I think it's very subtractive. It's like subtractive design, trying to pare it down to the essence of home, what one really needs, examining oneself to know what one needs, and then basically it becomes a self-portrait, a house does. But also in the messaging and everything else around it, it's all just true. And then I do think that, you know, there's the commercial side that sometimes, you know, I've read my own stories and I didn't write them, like people writing as Jay Schaefer, like bigger companies, they're like, I'm Jay Schaefer and I recommend this product. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's when I'm like, no.
Is that because you don't like beer from St. Louis?
Oh. No, I don't like beer from St. Louis, but that has nothing to do with this.
Oh, that's not the point.
No.
Okay.
Now, back to you, Dee
I'm
Williams.
tangential.
What about you?
So, as far as things I would do over, you know, I wouldn't have, you know, mistakes were made building my house. And I learned a lot since then on how to do a better job of insulating, particularly the trailer. I learned a lot about not using a skill saw to cut corrugated metal with flip-flops on. A lot of sparks, a lot of danger. I wouldn't have, you know, glued my hair to the house and had my, you know, so I'm yelling for my neighbor to come out and cut me free. And I'm up on a ladder. And she comes out and she does this and goes back into the house and gets a camera and then comes back, and that's memorialized now. And then got a pair of scissors and cut me free. I started carrying a zip knife with me after that, you know, just in case I had to cut myself free. So there was no more photo documentation of the mistakes. So yeah, there are things I would do different in building. In the house itself and the way it turned out, absolutely nothing. It's beautiful, and it fit me really well. And it wasn't perfect as far as utilities go, or having to run across the lawn and get water, or, you know, sometimes kind of being freaked out about, you know, walking up the driveway, across my neighbor's porch, around the circle that was Kellen's soccer field to get to my house. Like, that felt like I was entering their private space, and that took a while to get used to. So I just hadn't thought through those things very well. So it was surprising to bump into that. And as far as regrets go, you know, about 2 years ago, I'm gonna cry. My friend Annie was diagnosed with cancer, and then over 18 months got sicker and then died. And it just scared me so much I mean, this was a person I'd lived with for 10 or 11 years, and it scared me, and it made me unavailable. And I have a regret around that. And I'll work through it, but going small and living in community opens your heart up. And that's not always easy. It's a gift. But look at this. I'm an ugly crier. And now it's on film. Thanks, tiny house movement.
I thought I was going to have to make you cry. Authenticity by Dee Williams.
I guess that brings up a question about the tiny house movement for me. As I guess I'm curious about, what do you think? You already mentioned that it represents a lot of different things, right? But where do you think this is going? Is this a trend? Is it a fad? Is tiny as the new black? You know, where do you think it's going?
I have a feeling that, tiny houses were around a lot longer, have been around a lot longer than the McMansion thing. And I can't remember who said it. Maybe it was Alex Pino. Anyway, I like to think the McMansion thing would be the trend, the fad. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I don't think tiny houses are going away. Maybe as, I consider a tiny house to be two words, an adjective and a noun. And I think that now that I think this idea of exclusively big houses in the housing world, I think that day has come and gone. And so I really think that tiny houses are going to go on and on. It just may not be like on wheels, and the whole story around it may change.
Can you give a definition of tiny?
I've always protected myself, and I'm glad I was told by a friend I should never define tiny very early on in this whole thing, and they were very wise, and I'm glad I listened, because I've always said that a tiny house is just any house in which all the space is being used for the occupants' needs for comfort, safety, and happiness. So, if a couple in 7,000 square feet is stating that is their tiny house and they need all that space, I can't argue. In my head, I'm thinking, geez, maybe they haven't examined their needs, but for all I know, they have, and they need all that space. How do you define tiny, Dee Williams?
So for me, it's like, I think the tiny house movement has kind of come to represent something on wheels. That I can't remember who I was talking to that said it was something on wheels less than 400 square feet. And I think that I agree with your answer, more so. It's an excellent answer, by the way. But I think for me, it can look any particular way. And it can be any size, as long as all the space is being used. And it's being used in a way that's generous. So as an example, my folks had about a 4,000 square foot house. And they built it so that every Christmas, their kids and grandkids would come visit, and there was enough space for people to sleep in. That never happened. They had some visitors, but all of that space that they dreamed of, that they longed for, just wasn't really ground truthed with their kids and grandkids. So there was, it was too much. And it got to the point as they aged, they couldn't even go up the stairs anymore. So I think it doesn't matter about size. It's more about kind of being uncomfortable, having the house work perfectly 340 days a year. And the other 25, you tell somebody to go stay in a hotel. Or you tell them you'll come to their house for Thanksgiving instead of trying to host it. So so that's, and I guess like, it's so cool at this Jamboree to see travel trailers, to see schoolies, to see yurts, plus really beautiful houses on wheels, and then the potential for things not being on wheels, you know, the potential for building on skids or, you know, that discussion, I think is a really cool discussion to have. And then also drawing in, what do we want for people that aren't privileged to make a choice? They live outside and they're cold or they're getting rained on, and that affects your mentality. It affects your sense of being and your sense of belonging. So I like that the Jamboree is inviting that discussion into the privilege of thinking about buying or building a big, sexy, tiny house on wheels. That's my thought on that, Jay.
Nice.
So I guess some of the other questions I have for you are like, you know, you started this thing, and I'm just curious. We didn't talk about this yesterday, but you know, you've seen it grow into this. You know, what they were projecting, maybe 75,000 people would kind of pass through the Jamboree. Maybe not every day, but how does that feel for your sense of, I don't know, I'm not talking about ego, but your sense of being a contributor to something that has inspired so many people?
Well, it seems very abstract to me.
That question is abstract.
It is, and I have an abstract answer, or at least
Obtuse?
it's obtuse, whatever that means, I'm sure. Well, you know, I don't really feel like I started it because it was really me plagiarizing a ton of great ideas from hippie shacks from the 60s and settlers' cabins from whenever that was, and a lot of other stuff. It was fun compiling all that, you know, and looking at Lester Walker's Tiny House book. And you know, I do feel like I'm a meaning addict. So I feel like I really need a sense of meaning in my life. And most of us are that way. Some of us don't seem to be as much so. Some of us can place more meaning on the things that are, that we attribute the meaning to, but it's the meaning itself, like the glue, the social glue, the integrity, the integral whole. That's very important to me, sticking to that, because I have a hard time with little parts that don't make sense in that. And this whole movement is of integrity to me. And I actually don't know where I'm going with this answer, because I'm not even sure if it's related to the question anymore. But I'm just saying, yeah, it's really cool when people ask for my autograph. And when I get to be on TV, I like that kind of recognition for my work. But ultimately, it just comes back to it being, yeah, it's so huge. It's weird. And thankfully, I've just been able to not do much of anything except for design houses for the last 3 years, because the message is being propelled. It's on its own at this point. How about you, Dee? What about you when it comes to this movement? How do you feel being here amongst all these people?
Humbled. And, you know, when I decided to build my tiny house and live in somebody's backyard, you know, it wasn't my intention to sit on a stage in a puffy chair, drinking water that now makes me want to pee. The chair is puffy, though, so that's helping. So I feel really honored, and I've met so many amazing people, and I've been pulled into these conversations that I never imagined I would have. Conversations about voluntary simplicity, homelessness, green building, sustainability, happiness, vulnerability. I've bumped into my privilege and my way of looking at the world with entitlement. Like, I deserve to be warm in the winter. And I deserve to take a shower whenever I want. And I don't think I realized what a privilege those things were. And then, you know, my prejudice, I just brought this up in the class that we just did, but, you know, I realized I had huge prejudices about people that lived in travel trailers, in their car, under the bridge, you know, and so this is a story I just told. But I was, I would take Kellen, this little boy, 7 years old, to baseball practice. And I took him a lot, and I would always wear these baggy, possibly dirty coveralls, which were my kind of work outfit for doing carpentry. And one day I'm sitting on the baseball field waiting for his coach to show up, and he got a couple of other little boys, his friends, sitting there. And, you know, this little boy, not Kellen, says, "So are you Kellen's aunt?" And I'm like, "No, I just live in the backyard." And there was this, like, he's kind of like, you can see the wheels spinning, like, whoa, like, what does that mean? And all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, you're homeless." And I was just like, all of a sudden, this just like giant bolt of like incredulity. Like, I'm not homeless, you know? And it just, you know, processing that later, Kellen explained the situation, and it was very humbling to come to terms with that and to acknowledge it. I can't remember where that was going either, but it's completely true.
It was just a segue into my extended answer. Same here. The prejudice against people who obviously weren't working as hard as I was for their existence, living under bridges and all that. And through no fault of my own, of course, I wound up homeless myself not too long ago, unable to access my tiny house. And man, I have been humbled and more than empathize with homeless people. But it's kind of weird going to a jamboree like last year, knowing that where I come from, I'd be sleeping in a tent that night if I was lucky. But going to the jamboree and then being the rock star feeling like a rock star for a moment, you know, signing autographs, staying in a nice hotel, and it's like the two lives of Jay Schaefer, and so I've become way more empathic. And this, as long as this tiny house movement can be many movements addressing homelessness and how cool, you know, how luxurious can we make a house that's only 200 square feet, and every other story you want to put in there, I think I'm happy with that.
Another question, and this is more on the business side, but are you still pretty active with Four Lights Houses?
Four Lights has actually become, the website is somewhat of a ghost ship now. I have not been, I don't think I've looked at my own website but twice in the last 3 years because of traumatic events that have happened. And I just look forward, you know, all I've been doing for 3 years is designing houses, and all the media stuff and all I've just been sort of blowing off in favor of just doing what I love to do, the design part mostly. And unfortunately, that's not a very good business plan. And that is how one can become homeless, actually, just doing what you love and not worrying about how you're going to make money from it. Hopefully now I will begin to make tons of filthy lucre or good money because I have the best designs ever, and I think I'm ready to go through that weird process of releasing them now. So the answer to your question is, what's Four Lights? I don't know.
Okay.
And how's Pad?
So I have a company called Portland Alternative Dwellings, and I started it years ago to design and build. It was a combination. I was the designer, and my friend Katie Anderson, who's an amazing Finnish carpenter, was the builder. And we'd work together on the build sometimes too. But she was kind of bottom lining it, because she wouldn't be the kind of person that would almost light her feet on fire using a skill saw. And So I wanted to do that. And I also wanted to put plans out there for other people. I wanted to put a how-to book out there called Go House Go that was trying to help people not have to scratch their heads as much as I did on the engineering, the materials that are possible and stuff like that. So, that was my intent. And then we taught workshops. And then over time, I realized that PAD was just making me very busy. And a part of the reason I built my house was to be less busy. So Katie decided she didn't want to build houses anymore. And she was done with that gig. Are there any builders out there that have made the same decision? Okay, I want to hear from you in 3 years and see how you're doing. But it's hard. It's hard to find the right clients. It's hard to get something started and keep it going and push your energy into it. It really is like birthing something. And so over time, I just decided I didn't want to be that busy. Katie didn't want to build houses. So, we had a great website, and then we networked. I partnered with another friend of mine, Joan Grimm, and she was a business brain. She was, had read books like How to Do a $100 Startup. She had more of a business brain than I did, or Katie. So she kind of pushed really good energy in a really lean way into the company. So she was a breath of fresh air. And then we ended up partnering with this guy named Billy, who was a marketing guru. So all of a sudden, my role in the company was for them to just kind of, pick me up and, drop me where I needed to go. And I didn't have to, and do design work. But I didn't have to put all that energy out for a company. How many people own their own company out there? Wow.
Oh my gosh.
That's great. Keep your hand up. Drop it if you're a builder. Wow, a lot of builders out there. How about people that are bloggers? Awesome. That's great. People that do other stuff for the tiny house movement. Yeah, that's cool. And I'm so curious to see what your experience has been about putting your energy out into something that's just an idea. I met a couple of builders yesterday that their dream was just to help other people get through the process of building. Something really simple, something really generous. And so I think as far as PAD goes, I take a back seat and just do what Joan and Billy tell me to do. It's like I'm very fortunate that I'm pretty easily guided, except when I'm not.
Yeah, and along those lines, it was the chaos that ensued after quite a while after I started living more simply. The business side of things with the tiny house stuff got very chaotic. In 1 year, I received more than 100 threats of slap suits to try and shut my company down from other tiny house companies, the other movement. And that's actually when I stopped running a company. That was not the tiny house movement I wanted to be a part of. And luckily, I could choose not to do, I just started throwing those lawyer letters into the trash and stopped running a business and started living more simply again.
Is that the moment you bought the shotgun?
I can't answer that.
So we've got about 20 minutes. I think it would be cool to just kind of open it up to you guys. If you have questions for Jay, Schaefer, or me.
D. Williams.
You need this?
I'm going to grab this one, and I'll be walking around, so hold your hand up, and I will walk around and have you guys ask the question with the mic.
Jay, I'm curious, how did your first tiny house, or how did your fifth tiny house differ from your first? Because you said every time you built a tiny house, it got better. So can you talk about those lessons learned and how they differed?
Yeah. I actually, I think it has a bit to do with perhaps OCD and looking around, trying to, I think, like I said before, a house that's self-designed and self-built is somewhat of a self-portrait. And as I changed, and as I learned things, it was easy for me to just see how, oh my gosh, there's a wasted square inch over there. I've got to get rid of that, you know, and it turns out, you know, my first houses were very much based on sacred geometry and very straightforward, kind of like churches with the altar right in the middle, very central axis. And I got kind of tired of living in a hallway, for example, with the stove at the end as the altar. And so I started looking at Japanese balance through asymmetry, and, you know, even if it wasn't better, I think it's just fun to keep on evolving in the thing you love to do. And it seems that there's no end to that in house design. Thanks.
Hi, Jay, it's Lindsay. It's been a long time.
Hey, Lindsay.
And Jay and I actually know each other from Sonoma County. So this question, as you spoke about homelessness, obviously we've got thousands of people in our beloved Sonoma County that just lost their homes, and also north of Ukiah where I live. So I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about sort of where tiny homes could help in disaster relief. We've got Houston, Florida, and hopefully no more to come, but with climate change, it's possible.
On the road? Oh, right. Thank you. Thanks, Lindsay. It's good to see you. Surprising to see you, even. You know, during the Sonoma County fires, which actually I was just 3 blocks away from the evacuation zone, the voluntary evacuation zone, which means I was about 3 miles from the flames. So that was very scary. I didn't have my house on wheels at the time, so I raced out to buy a trailer and hurriedly put my house on wheels. What was interesting in that period was all these tiny houses coming out of the woodwork. It's hard, you know, people will ask, how many tiny houses are there in America or the world? I don't know. Nobody knows because most of them are quasi-illegal. Nobody really wants to come out. But when a fire comes along, they all come out. So there are all these tiny houses parked around. One was out on the freeway, like just parked on an exit ramp near I think it was the first fireproof area they could find. Another was just 2 blocks down from my house. And I think, the tiny house movement in general is already addressing this, in the sense that if you have a mobile house, that's a step forward in terms of natural disasters. Small is good for earthquakes. Number 1 criteria for creating an earthquake-proof house, seismic design, is make it small. You know, it doesn't take many 2x4s to support a shoebox in an earthquake. My focus for the past 3 years has been on this sort of thing. I don't think I've ever actually used the term homeless in my marketing because I don't think it's got so many associations. I've never even used the term affordable housing, I don't think, unless it's qualified, because that's got so many associations with what we've done in affordable housing, which is oftentimes dumb, you know. My answer to the affordable housing crisis that we have is build affordable houses. You know, I go to meetings where this is discussed and nothing is mentioned other than incentives and subsidies, and I'll mention maybe affordable houses should be built, and people look like that's a novel idea. So I actually am just building a prototype right now that it's almost dried in, and so far it's only cost less than $1,000 to build. So it's a shell without windows or doors so far. By the time it's done, it should be less than $2,000 without a bathroom or kitchen. But I'm thinking about people who just, you know, when you're walking the streets and it's raining, you're not looking for the kind of affordable housing that the government calls affordable housing. You're looking for a a dry, preferably insulated, safe place. It'd be nice if there's some place to keep your stuff there that was reasonably safe, where the cops wouldn't come along and throw it all away the next day when they found it or bulldoze it. I think the solution to all of this stuff, the emergency housing of either the natural disaster sort or the homeless sort, we already have this. We're in the solution here. People can dwell on the problem as much as they want, but the solution is right here. And we can do houses. We don't have to do tiny houses that are $150,000. We can do tiny houses that are awesome in terms of design, but only cost $2,000, that are insulated and dry. They float. This one I'm building floats. It's fireproof. I mentioned this to Sonoma County supervisors the other day, and they were like thrilled. Finally, they're on board. And so these things, I think, are changing the political landscape for the better. They're actually opening people's eyes to the need for it. Thanks, Lindsay.
So this woman, Shay Solomon, who's done, Jay knows Shay from a million years ago. I'll never forget, I had a chance to meet her and talk to her. This is just as I was finishing my house. And her comment was that we don't have a problem with homelessness. We have a problem with generosity. So there are a lot of empty houses out there. And trying to culturally shift away from looking at our homeless population as a problem I don't know if it's a pipe dream, but it is something for people to think about that decide going smaller isn't for them. If they have space that they could offer to somebody, whether it's an in-law that is going to be displaced or somebody that they've met for years, they see them all the time, and could open some space up for them, that's a beautiful thing. And it's so generous. So I think it's a really good question, and culturally we have to kind of take a look at how we view our solutions in order not to pity somebody and give them their dignity back. So I don't know.
Question back here.
This is for both of you, but I think one thing that Tiny Homes on Wheels doesn't address right now is density. And for urban dwellers, I think that's the biggest issue. And for city planners, tiny homes don't allow for the kind of density that a city needs. And so I'm curious whether you think maybe like containers that are stackable might offer a model that would allow for greater density, or maybe there are other solutions, or maybe density isn't something that the tiny home movement can really solve, and it's, we need, affordable housing in other forms. So yeah, just curious how we can address density in urban settings.
Me first. I've always, ever since I started designing tiny houses, I've imagined them in a high density cluster. That would be I think the best way to go with small houses, at least in my view. That's where I'd like to live, with shared amenities, so you don't have to have a washer and dryer in every house. In my case, I don't need the bathroom or kitchen as long as there's a bathroom and kitchen available to me. And I mean, it's ridiculous how expensive our housing solutions so far, so-called solutions, have been. I think we just need to get out of the way and I think high density this tiny house stuff is just ready for that. We've seen a little bit of it with the tiny house villages so far, and it can be taken, we can go high. I photoshopped a lot of images, especially in the beginning of the tiny house thing for myself, because I hadn't built them yet, but I wanted to build them, so I'd Photoshop houses on top of rooftops in the city, and there are so many places we can put these. If your mind's at all like mine, everywhere you go, like tiny house could be there, tiny house could be there, 20 houses could be right there in that one vacant lot that we haven't used ever. So it's a good question, and I think if our laws can get out of the way enough to let common sense happen, it's going to happen. And those laws have changed, largely thanks to the tiny house movement. Codes have changed dramatically in the last few years, and it's all starting to unfold. Sonoma County is now asking for tiny house villages. All of a sudden, now that the fires have come, and there are a lot of rich people also that are homeless now, suddenly they're more open to it, and that's very exciting.
So one of the problems with urban density, and I've talked a lot to city councils in Olympia and Seattle and Portland, is that there's this tension. Not everybody is wired the same as far as a need for space. And like there's this one neighborhood in southeast Portland that I absolutely cannot drive through anymore because it's so congested. And as an example, they built these apartments, and the idea when they pitched to the planning department to build these apartments, they said, only a handful of people are going to have cars, so parking won't be a problem. And it just was a complete falsehood, So some of the challenges with urban density are the infrastructure that supports that density. And so we have to, if we're going to go for greater urban density, we also have to look at that infrastructure and look at where people are going to park. And this is what a lot of the code is based on. Parking, utilities, trash, people being able to be in a livable, walkable, bikeable community and how safe that is. Urban density can bring risks of, fire safety. So it's a complex conversation to have about how do we get people living together differently in a way that opens them up to living the life they dream, as opposed to, like, there's a lot of chatter about, I think they're called apodments, A-P-O-D ments, up in Seattle. And the locals, after they were built, they were just furious because they couldn't park near their house anymore. There wasn't off-street parking, so they're parking blocks away, schlepping groceries or kids. And it was very frustrating to them. So it's a complex equation that we're working through, and there are brilliant minds out there. I wish you the best.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we're going to take this question and then one more.
Thank you. This question is for Dee, but I did want to say thank you to Jay. It was actually one of your YouTube videos that introduced me to this movement 5 years ago. So thank you so much, because we're still in the planning stages, but this is definitely something that we will be doing in the coming years. I appreciate it. Dee, I have a question for people who are looking to build their tiny house but have zero experience building anything at all. What advice do you have?
A couple things. One is, options. Find a builder. There's one sitting behind you and to the right. And there are others in the room, I'm sure. That might be one option, is to let go of the idea of doing it yourself and free yourself up. Do you have kids? You could go to the library and read to a kid. You can use your time to do other good. And bank that generosity by having somebody else build your house. Or you could keep doing the job you love and have that other person build your house. It's a complicated process to have somebody else build your house, though. The other thing you can do, and I've seen a lot of people do this, is to volunteer to help other people build. And so they're willing to be a lackey, to pick up stuff when they need to pick it up, to learn how to frame, to learn how to, be safe and not drink beer while you're operating power tools. Not that I would ever do that. I would never do that. But, to kind of volunteer to help somebody. And there are other volunteer organizations. I had experience with Habitat and with a couple of other organizations that built houses for folks that were living in the lower dump in Tijuana, and then also to build a school in Guatemala. So I was the schlepper. I was I'll go get that. What is it again? I don't, what does it look like? I don't know what that is, but I'll go get it. And then The other thing is that there are great resources out there. There are really great books out there. How to Build a Shed by John Truini is one of my favorite books. I leaned on it a lot. There's a guy by the name of I think it's I Ching, Building Construction Illustrated. You can Google anything anymore. So there are ways to educate yourself and figure out whether or not you want to do it yourself or have somebody else do it. And then if you are going to do it yourself, what does that really mean? Like, how are you going to get tools? You know, how are you going to find a place to build? How are you going to get wood from, you know, the local lumber yard to your place? I mean, are you going to have to buy a truck all of a sudden? You know, I moved all of the materials for my house on top of my car. And that wasn't like this 16-foot pieces of cedar siding. I strapped a ladder to the roof rack and then put the cedar on top of that so it wouldn't kind of bounce on the highway on the way home. And in retrospect, maybe great problem solving, but another one of those things that makes me feel like a cat with 79 lives. So, did that answer it? Okay.
Last question.
Hello, David Ray here. I wanted to say thank you, Dee, and thank you, Jay, for showing up. I had a question for Jay real quick. It's an honor, privilege to have you guys share this wealth of information for everybody. Jay, I was curious about the last question, the thing you were going to saying about the companies giving you lawsuits and trying to shut down the 4 lights or problems you had with that. Can you expand a little bit about what made these other companies jealous or why they were sending you lawsuits to your company to stop you from doing what you're doing? Like, what were some of those lawsuits about, or how were they trying to stop you, or why?
Well, actually, it seems like an invitation to a very flattering answer for myself, which would be, I think that they probably regarded me as the primary competition at that time when there were fewer tiny house companies, and I think psychosis may have had a lot to do with it. I don't know. I think that in the corporate world, there's a lot of, it's very dog-eat-dog in the corporate world, and that stuff scares me, so I just try to stay away from it. But thanks for that nice lead-in to, I think it's because they thought I was cool, and they felt like they just had to kill me. Thank you.
I want to thank both Jay and Dee for their insights and for their wisdom and for sharing that with us today. So thank you so much.
Thanks, you guys. Have a great rest of the jam.
Thanks. Oh, and buy my book.
Yes, buy their books.
I'm autographing in like an hour or two.
And thank you all so much for being here today. We have another...
Alexis and Christian here of Tiny House Expedition.
Click on the left or right to see more tiny house tours and stories.
And don't forget to click on our faces to subscribe today.